The Loop.
The Loop. You have the divine spark. The Loop.
Do or do not. There is no try.
The Loop.
Give me your word.
Hey there, this is Misha, and welcome to another episode of The Loop, the podcast where I unpack practical career advice from experts and coaches. Today's guest is Neda Jafarzadeh, and she is a people development manager, career coach, and certified professional coach who's worked at companies like Uber and General Assembly. She has developed learning and development programs from scratch. She's coached over 500 people in their careers to help them grow and find the right roles. And today's conversation was really interesting. It is about authenticity at work and authenticity in the interview process. And this is a really difficult topic for me because I think before going into this conversation, I didn't really have a great definition of that. And so Neda really helped clarify that and sort of the difference between authenticity and sort of different identities and roles that we hold in our lives. And we went over a lot. So one of the topics within that was how to have the courage, how to have the insight to know when you're being authentic and not being authentic, how Maslow's hierarchy of needs sort of plays into this, why if we're feeling desperate and not safe that it's very hard for us to be authentic, and very practical tips too. So sort of how to be authentic, how to be yourself in an interview where it's actually pretty hard to do that sometimes, right? Because we're a little bit nervous and we're trying to sort of put on a face. So Neda talks through some very specific techniques that you can use when talking to your prospective boss or whoever in the interview panel to really suss them out and also be honest and open about your strengths and weaknesses. So those are just a few things we cover, and there's a lot more. So I had a lot of fun with this conversation, and if any of that sounds interesting, then I think you'll enjoy it too. Hey, Neda, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Misha. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, me too. So one of the topics that we were discussing before the call that we definitely want to get into is this idea of authenticity, being authentic at work and being authentic in a job interview. So I'm really interested to definitely get into this topic with you and see where that goes.
Big topic.
Before we get into it's a big topic.
It is, yeah.
We could probably have a few episodes about that.
Yeah.
So we'll see what we can do in an hour.
Yep, sounds great.
Yeah, so it would be good to get a little bit of context into, first of all, like why this is interesting for you, because I know that you were at Uber, you were a career coach at General Assembly, you've coached hundreds of people in their careers, you have developed like leadership programs, so you have this experience, obviously, as a career coach. But what is this interest in authenticity? Tell me more about, maybe paint a little bit of a picture for me and why this is intriguing for you or important.
You know, I think all of those experiences that you just shared for me all come from one foundational thing about me. I am huge on self-development. I've always been. I even majored in philosophy when I went to UC Berkeley, and it was just like my attempt at trying to really understand identity. That was actually one of my biggest topics that I loved studying with Heidegger, and which kind of came back up in the coaching program that I took. So I've always just been really sort of interested in learning more about myself and what makes me who I am, and how do I improve? How do I get better? And what does better mean? And so the career that I've sort of formed, it was my way of bringing a bit of the philosophy and the self-development into more of like a corporate role. And so coaching ended up being really big for me, learning and development as well. And speaking of authenticity, I wanted those two because I'm an introvert, and I cannot handle like a ton of one-to-ones with people. It drains me. And I have like a huge part of my brain that loves to think about frameworks. As much as I love the one-on-ones, I like to think about big picture framework, how to improve how to help people with self-development at scale. And so I wanted to marry the coaching that gives me a bit of that one-on-one opportunity to work with people, along with the L&D, learning and development, building programs, creating development at scale, and sort of getting to use a bit of the two parts of my brain that I really wanted to exercise. So this topic is just something that honestly I just spend a lot of my time thinking about. It's my passion.
Yeah. Awesome. And I'm curious because like you worked at Uber and some tech companies, and I find that just from my experience, and maybe you could comment on it, it's like self-development and just this journey that you're on to grow in your career and your life and sort of build a toolkit and gain skills. I mean, it's a very sort of personal thing, right? And I think if you're coming in, like for example, like an L&D program, and you're telling people like, hey, like these are all things we're going to do, I imagine there's maybe some pushback, or not everyone's really as engaged as other people. So do you find that a lot, where there's just like some people that just naturally sort of progressed a lot faster? And then, I mean, what did that look like when you were creating some of these programs?
Oh, that happens all the time. You have folks that either have had opportunities to explore the self-development before, either through personal experiences or at work, they've gone through other learning and development programs, right? The thing that I always remind those individuals and that type of audience is that learning is never a one and done thing, right? You're not like, oh, I've done that and now I know myself fully, right? There's always opportunities for you to come back, for you to self-reflect on where have you been excelling with all of that work that you've done? What are areas that are still left for you to develop? Why? And take a look at those opportunities. And if you're going through even a workshop where I'm teaching you feedback, and you're like, I know how to give feedback, really, like I've had to do so much of that as a manager, right? Okay, but you can always improve. So like, what makes you really good at giving feedback? What are areas where maybe you're still having to kind of develop a little bit in that? And so I think self-reflection is a really important tool in learning, and one that really important in your journey to find your authentic self. And being able to reflect on your strengths and your weaknesses, or as I like to call them, more areas for development, all of those are super important, which, will come up in interview process as well. Those are the things that you kind of have to explore for yourself.
For sure. Well, that's a good segue. So let's talk about authenticity. And this concept is a little bit mysterious to me still, because
very heady.
It's heavy. I mean, so when I think of being authentic, the reason it's a little bit mysterious or confusing to me is because, like, for example, I feel like I have many sort of authentic selves, or, many identities that are true to me. So, like now I'm a podcaster. So like, that's one identity, right? I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a husband. I'm a runner. I have all of these different identities. I'm a son. One day, hopefully I'll be a parent, right? So how do I know which one of these is my true authentic self that I can bring to work or in a conversation? So that's what I want to clarify first. Like, what do you think about that? Yeah.
I mean, that's a really big question, a really good question. And my answer on this may change, by the way, over time as I reflect on this myself more. At the moment where you're catching me today, I kind of see it as identity is almost more of like the what of what you do, versus the authenticity is more of the how. It's how you approach problems, right? So be it that you're a podcaster or a father or future father, right? Or a husband or a son, how you show up in those interactions with people, how you show up in your approach in problem solving. I don't think that really varies much. That's like who you are. Hopefully you have developed that, right? And I think that that's where there are certain things we can do for self-development to kind of learn more about our authentic selves, which we can chat about what those might be. But that's kind of how I differentiate the two.
Oh, I see. Okay, so we all have different. Sense? Yeah, it makes sense. So it's just like a framing of it, right? So you have different identities, but you could be really selfish, and just show up to all these different situations and relationships in a selfish way, which which would not be very authentic. And so
for me, it's like I'm very energetic.
Yeah,
like my fiance tells me I'm very loud. It's like I'm just excited all the time. Like I want to interact with people, and you'll see that come through. In whether I'm at work, right? Whether I'm a professional, whether I'm with my mom, whether I'm with my friends, like that That's my energy and that's going to come through. And that's my authentic self kind of showing up in all of those instances, those identities that I carry.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the quote that comes to mind is, how you do anything is how you do everything.
Mm-hmm. My
And
coach used to call it showing up. You always bring yourself to the party. Like, you are who you are. You know, you're going to bring yourself to the party. Sorry, I interrupted you. What else were you going to say about that?
No, that was it. That just popped in my head because that's it's sort of like if you do things sort of half-assed in one situation, they'll probably translate to many other situations outside of work or whatever, right? And
I agree with that.
They just have this tendency, right? So okay, so that there's a distinction there between identity and authenticity. That's good. So what is okay? So tell me more. Like, what is being authentic then? Like, what is that really? How do you break this down?
I think my answer will be predicated by my own experiences and also my coaching program that I went through for my certification. I think there are certain basic questions that I have had to learn to answer for myself, and I help clients all the time answer. Some of the most basic ones are just being able to identify, what are your needs? That is like a really big one that I think an average person might struggle with, really being able to kind of name what are your needs in a situation or in general. How are you feeling? That's a really huge one. Even when I work with clients, you think that people can name their emotions, but it's actually a hard one if you haven't had practice in that. You know, I would ask clients, how are you feeling in our sessions? And at the start of it, right, just to kind of level set, and they'd say, I'm okay. But that's not quite an emotion, right? And that's okay. That just lets me know what are some of the areas that we can further develop on your way to getting to know yourself, or helping you with that. Another one is being able to answer, what matters to you, or even what are your values? So I think that even just starting with some of those, that's a good pathway to getting to know yourself, getting to know your true self, and bringing forward that authenticity. And I think a really big one that I feel like I'm still working on is, what do I have capacity for? Oftentimes we are ascribing so much of what we need to do to what other people expect of us. And that starts to kind of mar and confuse a little bit of what you need, right? Who you are, what you can give. And so that's a question I often come back to as well. It's just asking myself, what do I have the capacity for? And being honest about that and being able to kind of work from there.
Yeah. So there's a lot there, right? So it sounds like there's almost these questions that you would ask yourself. So I'm trying to think of like a specific situation where something has happened, maybe at work or maybe in an interview, like whatever. And then, you're trying to figure out, okay, am I being authentic in this situation? And then the questions that you just put out there, like, what am I feeling? And all these others, those would be sort of the answer, or help you answer the question, am I being authentic right now? Or am I sort of trying to cover something up, or maybe being a bit fake in the situation because I'm nervous or whatever.
Exactly.
So do you have any, like, I know you've coached a lot of people. Are there any, I know it's hard because like, I'm trying to ask for a specific example. I know you've got hundreds, but then to think of one on the spot is,
I know, I'll try my best.
Like, is there anything like that you can think of where, just like a normal example of maybe you're coaching a client and then trying to figure out if this interaction was authentic, and they're trying to like piece it apart. Like, how would you approach that?
I had some of my favorite ways to do that in my coaching is actually sometimes directly in my session with the client about our coaching.
Yeah.
One that maybe, and I don't know if this will be the perfect example, it's just the first one that pops into my mind. I had a client that was telling me about work, problems that they were having at work, right? And they were just going on and on and on. And I, in my own body, felt very agitated almost listening to it, right? And I wondered, if I feel that way, how's this person feeling as they're recounting? They seem very wrapped up in the story, right? And we're trying to, I think their goal was to figure out how to kind of find what they really wanted out of that situation, right? And they felt kind of like their teammates and stakeholders at work were kind of trying to get them to do certain things that they didn't want to do, right? And so as they were like telling me the story, I actually kind of paused in that moment and said, hey, like, I'm so sorry, I just want to pause for a minute. And, as you're telling me the story, here's the reaction that's bringing up in me. I'm feeling very like agitated, and I'm wondering, how do you feel right now? And they pause for a minute, and even just creating that pause for a second for us to actually kind of like hear like what our body might be telling us for what we're really feeling, right? Our bodies are so knowledgeable. And she was like, I'm realizing that I'm like really, really like wrapped up in this, and I don't really like even know what I want. And so that even just creating that space for them to like realize that, then it's like, okay, then let's talk about that, right? Like how did that situation make you feel? And starting with the emotions, I think, can create a little bit of that roadmap to get out of the story and more into what is happening for you. What's your experience? And so I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully that's just the first example that came into my mind. And then it's more from my personal coaching than the career side, but just kind of felt like a good one.
And how is that related to authenticity? Is it like that person was being sort of carried away by their thoughts or emotions, and then they weren't able to really figure out what they were feeling, like their true selves were feeling? They were just sort of going along with whatever very intense emotion.
Exactly. Or you're just kind of getting caught in like the story of it, right? And you're not able to really kind of connect with yourself about that situation, how it's making you feel, or what you might actually want, or what's feeling like off about it to you and why. And that can start to kind of clue into what is it that matters to you, right? Or what are your needs in that situation? And that's your journey. That is you practicing authenticity, even taking that pause. To me, that is a practice in authenticity.
What other techniques do you share or teach?
It always depends. I love journaling. I think that's always been like a really great tool that I use a lot. I always use that with my clients. Be it personal or career coaching, there's like either pre or post type of like journaling exercises that I'll create tailored to that individual. And the journaling can be, if we're starting with that client just on the journey of recognizing how they feel, like that's the skill they have to start with developing. Great. Then let's start there. And so it might be even doing like daily observations, like 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, evening, like just checking in. How am I feeling? And starting to build that vocabulary or that skill in identifying or observing how you're feeling. So that's more of an observation journaling type exercise.
So that's a place to start, right? So like if someone wants to, is asking the question like, okay, I don't feel super great or authentic or honest at work. Maybe a first step would be to start journaling just like 5 minutes a day. And like, okay, what do I feel exactly? And what situations do I feel this? And then that's just like really the initial starting point. Yeah.
Because that's like, if you can start to cue into your emotions, again, I think our body tells us a lot about how we're feeling actually. And if we can learn to read that or connect with that, it'll help a lot with problem solving. I have plenty of my own personal experiences where I've used my own emotions and how I'm feeling to help figure out like what's bothering me. And so I think that's a great place to start. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, cause like a lot of times, and I've noticed this as well as I've sort of continued on my, my journey, but you'll ask someone, they're complaining about their boss, and you'll ask them, well, how does that make you feel exactly? Like what is that emotion there? And then the response will be like, well, I think they're wrong. And it's like, well, that's not an emotion. You're just pissed off, right? You just think they're wrong, and it's all up here and not,
That's clue number 1. If you use the word think, you're not naming the emotion. And so actually sometimes what I will give as a tool is a list of emotions. I still prefer that list of emotions myself. Sometimes I can't quite name how I feel, and I like look it up and I'm like, which one of these helps describe it, and those are additional tools that you can put at your disposal, to create the resourcing around you that you need as you're on your journey of self-developing.
Yeah, for sure. There's a good series that there's an author and like emotions researcher named Brene Brown. And I think she's quite famous now in the US. And she has an HBO series that she released maybe a year or 2 ago called Atlas of the Heart, which I would personally recommend. I just watched the first season recently, and it just goes into everything you just said about identifying your emotions and I think it's just really powerful. So I'd recommend that.
I love that documentary. I watched it. I've seen her YouTube videos. That's another easy way if you don't have access to Netflix. And she's got a book called The Gifts of Imperfection, which could be another, I've only somewhat audio listened to it, but that could be another good resource for folks who prefer reading, maybe.
Yeah. Well, one question I had is, and I wanted to share a story also.
Yeah, I'd love to hear
this. It's around like knowing when you are being authentic, and maybe that there is some discomfort around that, and that's okay. So I remember when I was a recruiter for a few years, and I remember I was leaving. I put in my 2 weeks notice. It's actually a 3 months notice, so I gave them plenty of time. And there was a client which we were just about to close a deal with, and there was a moment where I could be honest or dishonest and say, "Hey, I'm actually leaving, so I'm not going to be the point person for you." And the other option was to be dishonest because there was some chance that we wouldn't win the deal without me there, because they wanted me as the point person. So there was this sort of dilemma, like maybe we won't get this client. It's a pretty big deal. And so I spoke to my boss at the time, and he was like, "Dude, just, you don't need to tell them. It's fine, because we can still deliver on it. Just think about the company." And I'm like, well, it just doesn't feel right. It's just not, I don't want to be dishonest with them. And then, maybe that hurts my relationship with them further down the line. Maybe I work with them in another context. And so it was actually quite painful and awkward for me to say, "Hey guys, I'm actually going to be leaving. I'm not the point person, but here's the plan." Yeah. And I had to go against what my boss said. And it was very uncomfortable. Like, it didn't it felt natural in a way, but it also was painful. And I think I was being authentic, or I feel like I was being authentic in that moment, but it wasn't a pleasant experience.
Of course. Yeah, that makes sense. But I also like what you said around it felt natural. Because sometimes I find when you're following your authentic self, in the end, you actually feel a relief. It's like you were meant to actually do.
Yeah.
How did it feel after?
No, it felt like a relief. Yeah, like you said. But just that initial sort of decision to do it wasn't pleasant. And so I think, I guess the lesson there is, maybe you, when you are being authentic, it's not necessarily going to be a fun experience. And maybe one of the signals or the signs is some discomfort, right? I mean, have you experienced that in any of your coaching sessions?
None that come to mind, maybe specifically around that. I probably have more personal moments that kind of show up for me. I don't know what the word is for me when I feel like I'm kind of going against my values or what matters to me, but it just sticks with me. That thought or that decision, lingers, and it's just kind of feeling like a tension with it. It might be accompanied also with feelings of shame or guilt, especially if I feel like I'm going against, and you're like, I can't think of one off the top of my head of a
sure, that's fine,
scenario, but I think that for me, it's those feelings around shame, or I have more around examples that are coming to my mind around when people want something from me and I don't even know how to say no, and I go kind of against what's right for me. And then afterwards,
I feel like a lot of people do that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Of course. It's normal, especially when you don't know your boundaries around things, right? You don't know what matters to you. That's part of the authentic journey too, I think. And I think that when I start to feel that, or what the other feeling could be that I feel, irritation.
What's that?
With other people, because it feels like they took something from me that I didn't want to give. And so I think when I start to feel those emotions, anger, irritation, or shame or guilt, I just start to examine, and I go back to again, okay, I'm feeling these emotions. That's step A, right? It's always recognizing that, which is a skill to build. I don't expect everybody can even start there. And then it's kind of processing through, well, why? What's the outcome I would have wanted? And once you answer that, then you can decide, is that something I can give myself? And if I can't, why not? maybe you have to kind of question some limiting self-beliefs there that you hold around expectations, or maybe you realize they can, and it might be just about having a conversation, right? Like in your scenario, I imagine maybe you go back to your manager and you're like, I thought about it. I appreciate, your point of view, but I have to do this, and here's why. And I want to be honest with you and tell you, that I plan to do this, and that this is important for this reason. And I think that can help to maybe resolve or some of that tension too that we might feel around following what we know is right for us.
Yeah. So there's definitely some fear there of being authentic, or, what people might think. Right.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So let's shift gears a little bit, because I'm interested in, certain situations where this is really hard, really hard to be authentic. Obviously, if you have a good boss, you have a good work environment, you like your colleagues, then it's a lot easier to be yourself. But one of the situations where it's just like really hard in general is a job interview, right? If you're going in and you're basically, it feels like you're being judged, and which you are in many ways. And you want to put up a face, right? You want to make a good impression. So it can be hard to be authentic for a lot of people, but that's obviously detrimental, because if you're not showing your real self and maybe you're sort of finagling your way into the company, it's either you're not going to get the job, or when you do get the job, it's just not going to turn out very well once they find out you're not really quite that person. So talk to me. Talk to me about like interviewing, like why is it so hard to be authentic in an interview, and like what sort of tips do you have for people? Yeah.
Well, before I answer that, I kind of want to preface the piece around why it can also be hard to be authentic in general, and then it gets, I think, aggravated or extra important in interviewing. I have found it's very hard to focus on being authentic if you are at a point in your life where you just need to take care of your own psychological safety, right? And so some of those, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like the bottom of this foundation is having your physical needs taken care of, like sleep, eat, food, right? The next one is safety, security, having a job, like some of the resources you need to be able to then lift your head above water and out of survival mode enough to start to entertain and have space for you to explore what matters to you and what you value and how you feel, right? So I think when we go to interviews, oftentimes we're wanting to get a job because we need the money. We need to be able to pay rent, right? Like there is, I think, a deep need that's attached to that starts to take away the objective of being authentic, because you have a higher overriding need of just landing that job to be able to take care of your needs. And so those two can compete, right? And I think it's important to recognize that. And I think some of the things, and there's other aspects too that can make it very hard to be authentic. Bad interviewers. I mean, I've been in interviews where some people think it's their job to intimidate you in the interview. And I hope that we're shifting the narrative on that. That's not the point of interviewing anymore, but you'll find that, or especially if you're interviewing with senior leaders, I think they can be a lot more hard to read. And so that can start to kind of put you a little bit on that, okay, I need to impress. Right. And so, I mean, all of those can kind of come in with you to the interview in terms of steps or things that you can do. I think pre-work is super important. I mean, first type of pre-work, I hope you're choosing roles that are fitted to what helps you be successful, right? So you're hopefully reading the job description, you see the type of skills they want you to exhibit, they align with what you're passionate about or what you like to bring to the role, which will make it easier for you to then highlight those parts of yourself in the interview. The other part I would say is knowing what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and being really comfortable speaking about those. We can chat about exercises around that. And hopefully going into the conversation, I always try to go into interviews not with the goal of impressing, but reminding myself that I'm here to have a conversation, right? I'm here to share about myself, but also to learn about them. And even when I get those super stern interviewers, right, I try to break through that wall a little bit at times. If they're asking me a question and I can't read their face, I'll check in. I'll ask, hey, did that answer your question? Or can I like provide a little bit more context, right? And I think starting to kind of let them know like, hey, I'm on your side here. We're both trying to figure out whether I'm right for this role. Can really kind of help to diffuse a little bit of tension, I think, or the expectations, and start to kind of remind yourself that these are going to be your colleagues. So hopefully you're starting to build the path for that even in the interview.
Yeah.
Was that helpful?
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's super helpful. I think the first thing you said, I want to unpack a bit, because you said that there's often situations where maybe we're desperate for a job. I mean, there's all these layoffs happening right now.
Yeah.
This is like a very timely discussion. And so you're like, oh crap, like maybe you got a good package, maybe you did it, but like, you know, we've got expenses, we've got families, we've got bills to pay. So like there's some urgency there. And, so when you're sort of on your back foot and there's some sense of desperation, even however subtle, that will change the dynamic, right? And you're more likely to people please, or sort of, you know, say what you think they want you to say. Yeah. So I think, how do you get out of that mindset?
You know, my brain goes to a few things. One, I actually see that showing up more even before you apply to the job. You might be casting a much wider net. Like I said earlier, hopefully you're applying to jobs that you're a fit for. But you may even take jobs where like, I'm not really interested in this, but I just need a job. You know, I have the skills. Maybe it's not what I'm passionate about, but I'm going to apply to it. So you can show up even a little bit beforehand in that way. And then when you're in the interview, I mean, I don't think there is a workaround. I think you have to be honest. If you want to lie, or, you know, say you have experiences and you don't, I think that will come through at some point, you know, be it that they want like an example out of you of a time that you did that and you like struggle with an example, or maybe you have made up an example and you get the job. You're not going to succeed in that role. And you're just going to be right back where you started, where you are right now, where you're not going to do well. Maybe you get fired or whatever it is again, and you're back on the search. So I think it's important to maybe invest a little bit of the time up front to find a role that you know you're going to be able to deliver. You're going to be successful. You can hopefully bring your skills to that, right? And really bring some impact to that role. And I think that might require a little bit more time up front, but I think it'll save you down the line and having to kind of go through that and maybe explain why you had another shorter job on your resume, right? Which will only make things a little bit more difficult. It's maybe a bit of a tough truth, but that's, I think, what my advice as a coach, I think, would be. I would never kind of advocate for, I know that maybe we really need that role, but kind of fudging or not really bring your true self.
What other, I mean, so fudging a role, obviously like blatantly lying is that's a big line to cross, which maybe is easier to cross in these situations. But what other ways have you seen people be inauthentic in these interviews? Like what other ways does that manifest other than sort of like fudging the truth a bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, for me, it's seen it show up. You know, I've had some coaching clients where maybe they are open to just saying like, yeah, I can do that. You know, I can do this job, or, and I don't mean that in like they're faking experience, but in they're faking enthusiasm, you know, or, you know, my version of that would be if I were to go into a job and tell you that I am your girl when it comes to like fun, kitschy ideas, like, that is so not me. I'm like such a logical, framework-minded person, you know, and I wouldn't want to like sell that I'm like excited to do that, because if you put me in that role, I won't even be good at it, to be honest, because like my brain just doesn't think that way. So I think that those are maybe some of the other examples that I have seen where it's just more around like, yeah, I'd be excited to do that, you know, because the role maybe requires you to do a certain skill like 60% of the time in that role, right? And so I think that's the only other
that happens a lot, and it's almost like just a reaction, right? It's almost just like a very impulsive reaction when the interviewer says, "Hey, like, you know, we really need this for the job," and you're like, "Yeah, I can do that. I'm your man." And it's like, well, like you just said that just so you could, get a thumbs up.
Yep.
And you haven't thought through, you haven't stopped and said, oh, actually, no, I don't like editing Excel sheets all day. Maybe that's not exciting for me.
And I think honesty is the best policy in that situation. And if they bring that up to you, if you're willing to learn that skill and it's something maybe you want to develop, you want to have it in your toolkit, right? You're not hoping it's the main one you have to use all the time, but it's good for you to develop it. Maybe it's a skill that is really required for the role. Like you can't escape it, then I think even being honest and saying, like that, I think would be maybe like a development area for me, but I would be interested in learning, and just kind of expressing more that like you're interested to learn, you might need support. And I think that that'll let your manager also know, hopefully future manager, that, hey, like I may have to lean in to this area when I'm going to be hiring and working with this individual, right? And you're setting yourself up for success too, where you're not saying, yep, I know all the formulas, like I can do that spreadsheet for you, no problem, to like, hey, you might need them to train you on it. And maybe with time, like you get better at it, right? And it's something you're less like hesitant to want to take on. And so I think that that's really important too, starting to set that relationship with the manager and putting your best foot forward in terms of being honest, because you're going to hopefully want to keep doing that in your one-on-ones. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you mentioned before, I think we wanted to go back to the topic of sort of strengths and weaknesses. And I guess like assessing that or finding out your own strengths and weaknesses for the interview. Like tell me more about what you meant.
Yeah. I think this is, again, where journaling practices can be very helpful. I think starting with even sitting down and thinking through, actually, let me start. If you really struggle with that in general, like if I were to ask you, like, tell me the areas where you feel like you excel or skills that you have or a gift that you have and you can't answer that, I would actually ask you to think about maybe some challenges you've overcome in your life. And like think through what did you have to do to get through that challenge? How did you have to show up? What skills were you able to kind of like showcase in that situation, right? Be it like resilience or whatever it is. And then start to kind of dig into that a little bit more to get into like, what are some qualities that you have? Because we were talking earlier, and I forget what your quote was. Mine is, you bring yourself to the party, right? Like, those are there. They're probably showing up in all kinds of instances. And so it's showing up at work. It's going to show up if this is your first job, right? So I think we start there. If they have a little bit more of a context around like accomplishments or areas where they've had impact, then it's more of a cataloging exercise, right? And starting to kind of think through, what are those, and coming up with really good examples, really kind of forming that narrative, the story. I know that there's the STAR technique that a lot of folks like to use, where, you describe what the situation was and the task and the action you took and the result. I like to really think through maybe adding the part of the result piece, like what's the real impact that you had? Because the result could be very like tactical, but impact can have a little bit more of a wider reach, right? Maybe like long-term, or even in terms of your relationships with people, like that could be impact with your stakeholders or your team members, right?
It doesn't have to be a number. Yeah,
absolutely. Hopefully you can pair it with both, right? But I think adding that and maybe even closing it out if needed with like, what did you learn out of that experience? What would you do again? What are things you learned you wanted to work on next, right? On your path to self-development. So, kind of doing a bit of that cataloging and that kind of like thought process. And then the third tool that you could use that I have done with some of my coaching folks that I've worked with, my clients, is having them reach out to 2 to 3 people, hopefully coworkers. It could be also like friends, and asking them, what are you good at? And like, what's the impact that you've had in the relationship or on a project, right? Like depending on what that relationship is. And also asking them like, hey, what's an area where like you could develop or you could grow a little bit more? And being vulnerable enough with yourself to take that feedback in, right? And kind of think through that. I think if you have a little bit of that data and that those stories starting to formulate and that self-awareness, it'll help you when you go into those interviews. And you can also work with a coach. I think, part of my job as a coach half the time is like reflecting back, like you tell me a story and I'm like, I've noticed this, hearing that, right? And like starting a conversation around that to help them gain a little bit of that self-awareness. Yeah. It's hard to notice those patterns in ourselves sometimes, right? So just that exercise of whether it's a coach or whether it's a friend or a teammate that you trust, you ask them like, hey man, what do you think I'm really good at? And then it may be surprising to hear
or maybe it's not surprising at all, and you just take it for granted because that's just who you are.
100%.
Right?
Yep. And even like the skill of asking for feedback, that in itself, if you can share that with your interviewer, like these are things that I like to do. I do ask for feedback. This is something I learned by asking this person, right? That in itself, I think, is hopefully a really admirable trait that a lot of interviewers are going to want to see from the folks that they're thinking of hiring.
Yeah, for sure. And this, I think this relationship with your manager is obviously super important. People, the reason people stay and the reason people leave is essentially because of their managers, or that's one of the big reasons. Mm-hmm. And so whenever I was recruiting and helping candidates find jobs in different companies, and even now through coaching, it's tricky because I know this is a fact, and I'm like, hey, you really need to suss out your manager in this interview.
Oh yeah.
And what I find often is the reason is I emphasize it is because after like a few months, someone gets the job and then they leave because of their manager. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, why weren't we able to figure this out through the interview? Why weren't you able to figure out who your manager really is and what the expectations are and the communication style and all these things? Yeah. And so there's something that goes wrong in the interview. And it's no one's to blame. I think people, interviewers are not perfect. And as a job seeker, you're also trying to figure this out. So I think it's on both sides, but what advice do you have around that?
Yeah. I love this question. I mean, as a learning and development person who focuses on leadership development, I think managers are the biggest lever, I think, in an organization. To answer your question, I want to highlight first one audience. We talked about those folks who like really just need a job, right? Where maybe you don't have the luxury of picking your ideal manager. Like maybe the role is right, the manager, you're getting hints you don't know, but you need that role. Yeah. I think the questions that we'll talk through in a minute are still important for you to ask. And it may not be that they become the deal breaker in you accepting that job because you need that job, but at least you get to go in a little bit eyes wide open, right? Around like where you are going to get support and where you may not get support. And you will have to seek that support elsewhere within the organization, hopefully, or from outside resources. So I just wanted to highlight that group because I don't want to forget about them. I know I've been in situations where like, I just needed the job and you don't get to pick your manager. My first job, I didn't even know what to look for. Right. So, kind of acknowledging that group. Now, in terms of when you're wanting to suss out the manager and hopefully you use that knowledge to decide if it's the right role for you, right? Whether you're going to get to bring your best self to work every day with that individual there to support you. It depends. There are some standard questions I think I like to ask or I recommend asking. And then there are some that I think have to be tailored to you. If you've had the opportunity to have jobs before, I would have you reflect on what did you like about your manager and get specific, right? Was it that they advocated for you? They gave you stretch projects, right? They helped you resolve conflict, or they were always available if you needed somebody to brainstorm with, like whatever that may be. Think through what are some of those qualities. And then on the flip side, if there are, hopefully not, but if there are areas, what are things that manager did that you didn't like? Or that didn't work for you, or that didn't set you up for success as an employee on that team. And so that way you can formulate questions around those, right? Sussing out, do they have similar qualities? Maybe they have different ones that add on to those positive qualities, right? Or do they showcase some of the areas that maybe weren't quite the right fit for you? And a few questions that I think you can always explore asking. One is around development. I really love that one. Like how do you develop your team? And I have gotten the whole gamut of answers from like, well, we'll make sure we do our like biannual check-ins and our review. It's like, okay, you're doing the bare minimum. I've gotten really good answers. Like if there's an area where you want to grow, like I would advocate to like put you on that project, but I would support you, right? I provide you the coaching that you need, but give you that stretch opportunity. Or I would invite you to show up to my one-on-ones with my own director, or their manager, cool. Right? Yeah. And like, have you have an opportunity to talk to them or hear how I work with them, right? Like those are the types of answers that I've gotten that I'm like, that's super specific. And I like that. Like, you didn't just make that up or pay me lip service. Right. So that's
just on that. Yeah. So like one thing that could be tricky that I find is just having the courage to ask that. right? As a job seeker, you're like sitting in there, and then I think oftentimes, you're getting a lot of questions, and then for an interview like at Amazon, for example, you barely have time to ask a question, maybe like one question at the end or something.
Yep.
And so well, first of all, you have to like pick the one or two questions that you really want to ask because there's limited time, but then also have the courage to say something like you just said, like, okay, what is your management style? Like, what is the development plan for me?
Yeah.
And that almost feels like a really ballsy question in a way, true. Right? So how do you think about that? Like, how do you get the courage to just ask that question?
So can I like also take away if like you don't have the time to ask those like ways that I would suss out the manager, and then I'll answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
I also judge the interview that I'm having. I like to think of it as like, if this were my one-on-one, how do I like the way that I am talking with my prospective manager, right? Like, are they taking the time to like just question, or are they like trying to make it a conversation? Can I get to know me a little bit, right? Pausing, right? Like just little cues like that, I think will hint what would your like weekly one-on-ones with that individual even look like? Because those are going to be like your key times when you're working with that person where you're going to be getting the support that you need, right? Even the part around if they ask you like what's the weakness or an area for development and you share it, like what their reaction to that is, right? Do they create a comfortable environment where you're allowed to have development opportunities still to kind of grow into? Okay, putting that aside, so maybe if you don't have time, even just the style of the conversation, right, can maybe cue you a little bit about what your report will actually look like when you're working together. I have definitely been in situations where it's really tough in the moment, especially when you've just come out of answering a million questions, to switch gear into like asking questions back, right? And if there's some questions that I didn't have like the guts to ask in the moment, or I didn't have the time to ask for in the moment, I have done this almost in most jobs I've accepted. When I get the offer, I will ask for a follow-up with that manager to just grab coffee, like a 30-minute chat or whatever it may be. Because
it's a really good idea.
The recruiters will offer it to you usually like, hey, do you still have some questions? Anything that we can do to make you... Because once you get the offer, now the ball's in your court, right? So
they want you.
They want you. And I used to be a recruiter. Like, I know how much we want to make it work at that point, right? And so that is your opportunity to be a little bit selfish in that way and say like, hey, like, I still have some questions around like, what would it look like for me when I work with this manager? Can I get like a coffee chat with them or a 30-minute follow-up, right? And now it's no longer the interview. And now it's like hey, like, how would it be for us to work together, right? The context has shifted a little bit. So hopefully that helps you with the courage and the casual environment that you might need to be able to ask questions like that.
Yeah. So maybe if you don't have the opportunity throughout the interview, especially, I think this happens a lot with Amazon. It's a company I work with a lot to hire for. And that's actually the same thing I would tell candidates. I'd say, hey, like, you're probably not going to get too much time to ask a bunch of questions, but let's just focus on getting you the offer. And once you have the offer, then the hiring manager wants to hire you. They're going to make time for an hour meeting with you and really go through all your questions. And so I think, you can apply that to any company, right? Oh, yeah.
I mean, I did that for my manager at Uber. Everlane, I had to meet with the CEO during my interview, and it was like definitely question. And we got coffee afterwards when I got the offer, and like it was an opportunity like, okay, let's actually just like put that aside. Like, I'm going to be one of your main resources in the company. So like, how can we work together? Do we fit? Right. And so, and he was open to it and wanted that, obviously. Like, I'm speaking CEO level, a little harder to get, right? But with your manager, you can absolutely get that access.
Did you feel that like in those conversations that those interviewers, or like the CEO or the hiring managers, that they were really like in interview mode? And
yes,
so, because like I think the problem, or one issue could be, is that you are judging the entire company and position and experience based on the communication style within that interview. Whereas in reality, that's just one context, and it's really like a question context, because they want to assess your skills. And so it would be premature to make that as like the full judgment of the job. until you've had a chance to maybe have a more casual conversation outside of that sort of pressurized environment, if that makes sense.
I absolutely makes sense. And, I think this is where hopefully you can also bring a little bit of your own maturity to the situation and realize that every role that you go into, not everybody is going to be your best friend. And not everybody is supposed to be your ally. You're going to have folks that are your stakeholders, right? They're the people you will always have to convince. You always have to take time to get to know what they need and like package things in that way to them so that they want to hear it and they understand it, right? And so for me, when I have those like very like question, stern, I mean, the CEO obviously is like definitely going to be a stakeholder to me, right? But I've had those like director level or senior manager people that I've had to interview with. If they come through that way, I put them in my stakeholder bucket. Like, no matter what, you can't escape those. You're always going to have those in your role, right? So like accept it, put them in that bucket, learn how to work with them. And then I am sussing out, do I at least feel like my manager is somebody I can get along with? One team member maybe that I can meet that I like, that I think, if I have to work with this person, I'm going to enjoy it. That's a tough one too, because sometimes you only meet one team member out of all of the team. And that could be another follow-up to the manager. Like, I'd love to meet another person on the team when you get that offer, right? But I don't think everybody has to be your best friend, and you're going to have stakeholders that you have to tailor your style and work with them a little bit, and that's just part of being a professional. But at the same time, hopefully you're finding some folks that are like, yeah, this feels like a good culture fit. Like day to day, I can see myself being on this team.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's okay if there's maybe like one or two people and out of the 7 or 8 people you meet,
there will be
that you're like, okay, this isn't like my favorite person, but I can still talk to them.
Yes.
At least if your boss and a couple of other people are, they're on your side and it's easy to, natural to speak with them in a way, right? Then it's a good sign.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I feel like before we got into that, we were talking about something else. What were we talking about? I think we were talking. Yeah, we're talking about the interviews, strengths, weaknesses, managers, sussing out your manager. Is there anything else you want to share about? So we sort of talked about sussing out your manager bit. That's really important. How to do it. Is there anything else you want to share on that?
Nothing top of mind. I think we've covered some of the big buckets. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, what about? So, let's say you get the job, right? And you've maybe had a few offers. You chose the best one. What suggestions, what advice do you have for, again, going back to this, like in the framework of being authentic and bringing your best self to work? What advice do you have for people that are just starting in a new role the first 3 to 6 months?
Yep. Well, my first advice is don't expect other people to put together your onboarding plan for you. You're going to have a lot of variance of how people do that and how good they are at it. You have to own your own onboarding. Not to say, obviously, like welcome any resources.
That's counterintuitive. That's counterintuitive. I don't think most people most people don't think that, right? Most people are like, okay, I'm going to get to this company and then like, I'm sort of waiting to see the first 2 weeks are going to be slow because I'm just going to watch some videos and meet some people. So I don't think most people see it that way. So that's very counterintuitive.
And it's funny because I'm a learning and development person where like I work with the folks who develop onboarding for the company, right? And of course the company puts a lot of resources and support and like headcount towards like developing that support, right? But I also know the limitations of those programs. And a lot of times if the company onboarding will likely be more tailored to helping you learn about the company, learn the company values, the company history, the products, the architecture, the hierarchy, like all of those teams, right? Hopefully that the managers have also been taught a little bit about how to onboard effectively, but I don't know that every organization necessarily does a very successful job at that. I think the companies like Facebook and like kind of the big companies will, right? Which hopefully is what a lot of this audience may be looking at. I think they have more built out resourcing for managers and teams. But you don't want to leave your success in other people's hands. So I think you have to also be willing to own your own onboarding. And that can look like a few things. Learning the role, that I think is you can definitely lean into what the manager will put together for you. They're invested in making sure you learn the role because they're going to need you to ramp up, right? So lean on those. I think that's fine. The area that I think a lot of people don't put a lot of focus on is relationship building. And so when you start, I think it's important, if your manager hasn't already done this for you, hopefully they have, but to ask for a list of folks that they think you should meet with. On the team, yes, but also outside of the team. Who are going to be your main stakeholders? Develop that rapport with them early on, especially before you are working with them. Because once you start working with them, your relationship becomes all about that like project, right? And it gets a lot harder to get to know each other. So do it early on where there's still like no expectations of you, where you can just make it more about like, hey, I'm Neda, introducing yourself, letting them know you're there on this team as a resource or whatever it may be, right? And like getting to know them one-on-one a little more personally and developing that rapport so you can leverage that once you start working with them on a project. So developing trust, that's super important. Learning about your team, again, before you start working with them, because once you start working, tensions can rise if you have different styles of doing things, right? So take that opportunity to build that trust and get to know them. I like to even ask questions like, what stresses you out, you know, so that I'm aware of like, what are things that like make that person stressed?
It's a good question.
That has helped me a lot in knowing like what, you know, what to avoid, or like, okay, there's stress. It's not about me, like how to work with them, you know, how do they like to receive feedback? You know, like let them know you're open to feedback, like get to know what they like to do for
I feel
fun.
like you have a list of these questions somewhere.
Oh my gosh, they're in my head at this point.
Yeah.
I built them literally for my company.
You should make a little cheat sheet.
I
like
should.
That would be cool.
I'll add one. I'll make one. I've made them for my companies, so it's also like in my head. But yeah, I mean, those are the types of things. And then I always think another question to ask your manager, not just stakeholders, but also like who could be your allies, or just people that like could be great for you to network with, that they think you might get along with, you know, that might become your friends. And then you do your own work in finding those. You know, a lot of engagement questions often ask, do you have a best friend at work? And it's because research has shown that having a friend at work can really help with your engagement. And I think that's so true. Like, you know, I have always had like my people that I like to go to, that I have lunch with, you know, and just somebody that like I can be myself with, or if I'm having a tough time on my team, that I can go talk to them about it. Right. Like, so kind of having your like network and your support around you. And I think that's really up to you to build that. Your manager can help guide it or offer resources and suggestions, but you may have to ask for it because they might not. But that's going to be like super important to your success.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I think like it also goes back to the same thing in interviewing. Like you have to have sort of the courage to do that, right? To go out and start. I mean, because you don't know anyone, you're sort of the new person. So you have to have this sort of energy and courage to go out and start doing that and put in that effort. And how does this change in a remote company, or more remote, like just for most companies right now?
Yeah. I'll answer that. And then if you struggle with asking for like going out and making those connections, maybe ask your manager if they can make the introduction. That can also be helpful, by the way, and you not feeling like you have to be the one to reach out. And your manager can explain like, hey, they're going to work with you in this kind of context, right? And so that's you start talking about the role first, and then you kind of get to know each other. Okay, remote context. So that's onboarding in a remote environment is so hard. You know, you're not there. You're not getting to have the face-to-face. You don't really know the company culture that well because you're at home mostly, right? And so I think that the leaning into maybe more casual one-on-ones especially can be really helpful for that. Starting with your own team. Maybe don't expand yet to like stakeholders and all of those people. Just start with your own team because you're going to get to work with them every day. So you want to have that rapport and kind of start there. Or maybe even if you have the courage and maybe the sixth courage as well, like asking your manager like, hey, can we have like a next team meeting where like maybe you help me get to know the team a little bit, you know? And like as a manager, that is something that you can do, is facilitate like, hey, here's this person, and then go around and have each person kind of intro themselves a little bit. Like, what do they like to do for fun? And so hopefully you learn a couple of things that you can talk with that person about, right? I have had from any managers out there that are listening to this too, or if you're an employee, maybe you can ask for this. Even putting together like a slide about yourself as an intro in a team meeting, and you can share a little bit about yourself. Or maybe you put together something your manager sends out to the team if you're not okay with presenting, right? Just starting in small little ways, finding your comfort, asking for support with your manager to like be there as your ally. But just starting with the casual one-on-ones where it's less about the work and more about, hey, this is who I am. I just want to get to know you a little bit. And I promise you, it's always going to go well. I have never had one of those go badly. Like, people are always super friendly. They want to get to know you. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of that confidence that I think you'll be surprised how enjoyable that conversation will be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's harder to emphasize that sometimes, even though we all crave, strong relationships. It's harder to emphasize that sometimes when we're not around people or not in the office, right? And so you sometimes just want to be like heads down. Okay, I'm going to get into my work. I got to get good at this job, figure out all the tools. But if you don't have those relationships at first that are strong, then it's just going to be a lot slower. Yeah. You're going to get frustrated. You're not going to be able to push back or figure out what you need to do in the long run. So.
Right. And I think I'm pretty sociable, even though I'm an introvert. I don't love it. I'm not going to lie. Every time I would look at my calendar and I see that 30-minute block and I'm like, oh, okay, I got to put on the like sociable Neda, But I think what helped me was setting goals. Even just saying, I'm going to do 2 a week, and then you get those 2 done, like you'll feel good at the end. Like you've built 2 more relationships you can lean on, but maybe if you're like adverse to that a little bit, like just set a goal around it and just kind of try to like do it in a way that feels manageable to you. Doesn't mean you have to have like 10 in a week, right? Just do like a goal that kind of works for you.
Makes sense. Random question. Are you more of a cat person or a dog person?
Oh, definite dog person.
Okay, interesting. Yes, I read some research recently about dog and cat people and how introverts tend to be more cat people and extroverts tend to be more dog people. So I'm just
I don't like cats
this.
Because I am a cat basically. I have very cat-like tendencies of wanting to be left alone, and I want attention when I want it, but don't talk to me otherwise. And so I don't get along with cats.
Cats are too similar.
Yeah, because then we're never on the same wavelength.
There's only room for one cat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
That's
can I
cool.
add one, by the way, sorry to bring it to the thing, but it just popped in my head.
Please.
Another area, if you have the courage, but hopefully it'll make you feel better when you do, is finding ERGs in the company, employee resource groups or interest groups, that are based around like identity or interests, where maybe you can find people who are kind of like you or share a similar interests to you.
ERG doesn't sound very cool. Like it's kind of hard to remember. Is it just a group, just like group, like internal?
Yeah, it stands for
basically?
employee resource groups. So most companies, the big company, the Facebooks, the Amazons will all have it. You have like your Black employees or your Asian employees or your veteran group or your LGBTQA plus group, right? And so you can find identity-based groups that you can.
Just groups, okay.
Yeah, and they're all employees, so you get to network with individuals that hopefully you have a lot in common with, and you may make friends that way, or you may realize, oh, you're actually like on my team, or you're a stakeholder, right? And now you have a cool connection. Or if you're like the gutsy type, which, I did this at Everlane, you could start your own. I started one around meditation. I was deep into my coaching program, and I like needed to meditate, and I wanted to find other people to support me, and I started it, and it was small, maybe a handful of people showed up, but I loved it. Like I got to meet people. We would go on walks. Sometimes when we're like meditating, half meditate, half walk, and the CEO is a huge meditator, which I think prompted me to feel like comfortable doing that. Right. But hopefully your company supports that. You can ask HR or your manager should help you like navigate that process if you want to do that. And that's like another really great way to find people who you connect with, and a great way to be authentic. Because you're getting to bring kind of who you are a little bit to the role and to the company. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's sort of like, okay, especially even if you've just started, it's like there's something you enjoy doing. There's probably, if it's a big enough company, or even if it's a small company, there's probably people that also enjoy that thing. And then work is already a place where you're doing some shared activity and you're going to make friends.
Right.
But within that, if there's even another activity that you're interested in, then this is how you build relationships, essentially.
And if you can lead it, you get to now start, like, as a new person, now suddenly, like, you become a veteran in a way, right? Where you're like, I'm starting this, like, I'm your resource for this, right? And it helps you to feel your confidence a little bit more. And even for me, like I had that slot every week, no matter what. I worked meetings around it. It didn't matter. I refused to cancel that time. And I think that was also me modeling, like this is something that matters to me and I'm going to hold a space for it. And never would a manager come and be like, hey, this thing you're doing for the company, stop doing that, right? Like that actually can become like a thing you add on your review at the end. Like on top of all my job responsibilities, I've been doing this for the culture of the company, And so that could be another great opportunity to kind of build your confidence a little bit too and start to really own your space at that company and culture.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've gone over a lot. I think we're coming up on time soon. But are there any other? Yeah, we're over time, aren't we? Are there any tips or any other pieces of advice that you wanted to share when it comes to this topic of authenticity in the interview, authenticity at work, or anything else?
Maybe my last small, a little harder to grasp one would be, find opportunities to slow down. I think we're all just so caught up in doing and having to be things and be everywhere. And it's really hard to find your authentic self when you're just like either in that survival or go mode. And so find opportunities for you to slow down. Like yesterday, I even was going to go on a walk to the grocery store with my dog. And usually I listen to podcasts because like I must be learning at all times. And, and I was like, I don't want to do that today. I just want to go for a walk, listen to the birds, breathe in some air and not have to be anything. And I think it's in those spaces that you're able to start meeting yourself. So find time to do that, be it through a walk, a meditation, yoga, whatever, cooking, whatever that looks like for you. But create daily time in your day where you're not doing anything. You're just being yourself.
Amazing. Yeah. I think that we could all use a little bit more of that. And also, just to mention, you are also a coach, of course. And what kind of coaching are you doing right now?
So I do personal coaching, just kind of working with folks. They bring their goal to me and then we work through, what that would be. A lot always around self-awareness. Career coaching, I'm on the Karis platform. You can find me on there too. And I work with either first-time job seekers who want support from end-to-end job search support to more with behavioral interviewing, or you're re-exploring your career, or whether you should leave your current role for a different role. Like, I can support with all of those. And then I also work with leaders on leadership development and coaching on that end. So kind of a couple of aspects of the professional and personal.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I will link back to your profile and all of that so people can find you.
Cool.
And I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.
I thought we covered a lot of good topics, and hope to maybe have you back on the podcast sometime. We can go over some more stuff.
Yeah, I'd love that. And thanks for having me. Great chatting with you.
All right. Thanks, Neda. Thanks for your time.
Bye.
See ya. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And I just wanted to share with you Neda's profile here, as I mentioned. So look, if you are really interested to sort of plan out your career, your next career move, if you want to get into this topic of authenticity and go through some mock sort of practice conversations to sort of uncover a little bit more about what you're feeling in the moment and figure out, what is my authentic self at work, then I think Neda is obviously one of the best people to speak to about this. And you can go ahead and if you're interested, you can book a call with her. You can chat with her. I'm looking back to her coaching profile here, and you can check that out and speak with her if that's something that you think would be useful right now for you. So, all right. Well, I would love to know what you thought of this conversation. So please let me know. Drop me a message on LinkedIn, in the comment section on YouTube, and I would love to hear from you and what you thought. All right. Well, until next time. See you.